Hello everyone, today we are going to learn about the joints and its classification. So what do you mean by a joint? In Gray's anatomy, it is defined that joints are regions of the skeleton where two or more bones meet and articulate. So essentially, if one bone is meeting another bone and you have some kind of a tissue in between, that is called as a joint. So we often think that joints are always mobile, but it need not be always like that. It is a place where one bone can meet with another bone. As you know, the mobility of the human body is essentially due to joints, but that doesn't mean that all the joints are mobile, and that point is very important when we learn about the joints. Joints are places where you have close physical connection between bones. So many of the joints in our body are permanent. Okay, if you look at an adult skeleton, so you can see a lot of joints between bones. For example, this one, this one, this one. So a lot of joints are there, but there are also temporary joints, especially in the immature skeleton. For example, it is often students forget that this is actually a joint. The place in an immature skeleton, that means before skeletal maturity, between one bone and another bone, and between that you are having a tissue. Okay, a tissue is present here. That is a cartilaginous tissue. So that is also technically a joint. Okay, this is also a joint. So that point is also important. So there are some temporary joints like this. From a functional context, you can think that joints essentially provides opportunity for movement. But in some cases like these temporary joints, these are essential for growth. Okay, these are essential. This is called the physis or the epiphyseal plate, and that is essentially important for growth. So these are two functions that you can think about joints. Now, what is the structural classification of joints? This is a very common question asked in examination, the classification of joints. I want to remind that this is an anatomical classification or a structural classification of joints. So in this classification, joints are classified into three. Very important. You have a synovial joint, you have a fibrous joint, and a cartilaginous joint. This fibrous joint is subclassified into syndesmosis, sutures, gomphosis, and Schindlises. Okay, this many of the textbooks sometimes avoid this bone. There is only a single example for that bone, but the other three are important. Syndesmosis, sutures, gomphosis, and also Schindlises. They are called the fibrous joints. And cartilaginous joints are subclassified into primary and secondary cartilaginous joint. So these three are the main classification, and they are subclassified into these ones. Now here I want to focus on the synovial joints on today's session. About the fibrous joints as well as the cartilaginous joints, these two I will be dealing in other videos later. Okay, so what are synovial joints? Synovial joints has some typical features. This is a synovial joint, and let us look at what those features are. A synovial joint will have a hyaline type of articular cartilage at the surfaces forming the joint. So you can see here, this is one bone, this is another bone, and between that you are seeing an articular cartilage. Okay, this coating is called the articular cartilage, and that cartilage is a hyaline variety of cartilage. Articular cartilage is a hyaline type. So that is one of the features of a typical synovial joint. Another feature is that it is surrounded by a joint capsule. All right, over here you are seeing a joint capsule, and that is also called as the articular capsule. Now, inside that you have a joint cavity, also called as a synovial cavity, that is filled with synovial fluid. It contains synovial fluid. Now, in this picture, it looks like it is ballooned with synovial fluid, but that is not actually the case. Usually, you have only a capillary film of synovial fluid. Okay, only a capillary film of synovial fluid is present over here. Now the next is that the capsule is reinforced outside or inside by ligaments. That is also very important. You can have ligaments outside. They are called extracapsular or extra-articular ligaments, and sometimes you can have ligaments inside, and these are called intra-articular ligaments or intracapsular ligaments. Both of these are important. For example, in the knee joint, you have very important cruciate ligaments that are located inside the capsule, and the collateral ligaments, the tibial collateral and the fibular collateral ligaments are located outside the capsule. Both these locations are very important. Then the next is that this is actually the essential definition of a synovial joint. A synovial joint will be lined internally by synovial membrane, and you can see the synovial membrane over here. This red colored one that is lined internally within the synovial joint, that is called as the synovial membrane. And the definition of a synovial joint is that the synovial joint is a joint where the joint cavity is lined by a synovial membrane. So this is the most important feature, the essential feature of a synovial joint. Now the next is that the synovial joint is usually capable of various degrees of movement. So generally synovial joints move, in contrast to the fibrous and the cartilaginous joint where the movement is very restricted. Alright, so these are the typical features of the synovial joint. Now let us look into the sub-classification of the synovial joint, which is very, very important, very commonly asked in examination. Now, synovial joints are classified based on the shape of the articulating surfaces. Okay, shape and the features of the articulating surface. For example, synovial joints are classified into ball and socket joint. Then we have a hinge joint. Then we have what is called as the pivot joint. Then there is gliding joint. Then there is ellipsoid joint. Ellipsoid joint has had other names earlier. They were also called as condyloid joint. Not condylar, they are condyloid joints. And then we have the sellar joint, which is also called as the saddle joint. Okay, these are the types of synovial joints, and they're classified based on the shapes. You can see the shapes and the the degrees of freedoms of movement that are given by these joints. All right, now let us look into each of these 6 types of synovial joints. The first we'll go to what is called as the ball and socket joint. Let us have a look in detail about the ball and socket joint. Ball and socket joint, a classic example is a hip joint. In a hip joint, you have a socket. In this case, this is the acetabulum of the hip bone, that is the socket. All right. And then you have the head of the femur. The head of the femur is the ball. So that is the ball. So the point is that this will actually give you a lot of freedom of movement. Okay, this gives you the freedom to move, to the flex, extend, abduct, adduct, and also rotate within the joint cavity. So this gives 3 degrees of freedom. That is shown by these arrows. This is 1 degree, this is another degree, and this is another degree. So it gives 3 degrees. This is showing you the rotation. This is showing you the abduction, adduction, and this is showing you the flexion, extension. So these 3 degrees of movements are given by the ball and socket joint, and hip joint is a classic variety of it. Another example is shoulder joint, and also another one that is commonly asked is talocalcaneo-navicular joint. In this, you have the head of talus that is appearing as a ball, and the calcaneum and the navicular together forms a socket. So all of this gives 3 degrees of freedom, and a lot of mobility is usually given by the ball and socket joint. So here is a model that can make you understand what is a ball and socket joint. This is a socket and this is a ball. The spheroidal head, suppose this is a humerus and this is the glenoid. Then within this can abduct and adduct, right? Then this can also flex and extend. Okay, and it can also rotate inside it. Okay, it can rotate because this is a ball, it can rotate inside it. Now let us move on to the next type of joint. The next type of joint is called the hinge joint. Hinge joint, as you know, the doors have hinges, just like that. Hinge joint will have an axis that is running like this, right? An axis that goes like this, which provides 1 degree of freedom. It is usually a uniaxial movement. Here you can see it is a multi-axial joint, but this hinge is a uniaxial joint. The typical example is the elbow joint, where you can see that you have the distal end of humerus, the radius is over here, and then you have the ulna, and this gives you the movement that occurs in hinges, like, right? The humerus is over here and the ulna and the radius can hinge over it like this. Okay, that is called the elbow joint. This is a hinge joint. The other hinge joints that you need to know are the knee joint. Knee joint is said to be a modified hinge joint because in addition to this normal hinge activity, hinge action, there is also slight amount of rotation. They are called conjunct rotation that can occur in the knee joint. Then you have the interphalangeal joints. They are classical hinge joints. Suppose this is the distal end of the humerus. with a rounded surface over here, and this is the proximal end of the ulna. This will articulate like this, and this will be the axis. The axis will be running like this, and this will be the movement. Okay, it is a hinge joint, allowing only 1 degree of freedom of movement in the axis that goes like this, okay, in this direction. Okay, so this is a typical hinge joint. With that, we'll move on to the next joint. The next joint is called the pivot joint, also pronounced as pivot joint. Okay, both are same. The pivot joints will give you a ring. Okay, there will be a ring, and inside that there will be a peg-like structure, and that peg-like structure can rotate inside the ring, or the peg can be static and the ring will rotate. That is called the pivot joint. So the classic example is the median atlantoaxial joint. This is the atlas bone. What you are seeing here is the atlas bone, and what you are seeing here is the dens of the axis. Okay, so you can see that this ligament is called the transverse ligament of the atlas. The transverse ligament of the atlas and the anterior arch of the atlas together forms a ring, and in that ring you can see that the dens of the axis is going to rotate inside it, okay, or this is going to rotate around it. Okay, so that kind of a movement is called as the pivot joint. Okay, another example of that is so this is an example of a pivot joint where the ring is rotating here in along a median static axis. This is the case of a median atlantoaxial joint. Another case where the axis can rotate in a static ring is what you see in the proximal radial joint. The proximal or the upper radial joint gives you a case where the axis will rotate and the ring will remain static. So these are the examples of pivot joints. Now let us move to the next joint. The next joint is called the gliding joint. The gliding joint is also called as the plain synovial joint, and the classic example are the small facet joints that you see between vertebrae. They are called facet joint or facet joints. Now, facet joints allow gliding movements around like this. Okay, this type of joints are also seen between carpal bones, and they are called intercarpal joints. So, intercarpal joints are also examples for gliding joints. The next type of joint is very interesting. This joint is called the ellipsoid joint. Ellipsoid joint, on a first look, it looks almost similar to that of ball and socket joint, but there is one difference. If you look at this, you can see that here there were 3 axes, but here there are only 2 axes. Ellipsoid joint does not allow for the rotatory movement. There is a rotator movement that you see in ball and socket joint, but that is not present in the ellipsoid joint. The classic example for this is the wrist joint. The wrist joint is between the distal end of the radius. Okay, this is the radius. The ulna is not involved in the wrist joint. You only have a fibrocartilage. You have a, let me change the color over here. Yeah, you have a triangular fibrocartilage over here. So that fibrocartilage will separate the ulna from the other carpal bones. So between the radius and the fibrocartilage and distally the first row of carpal bones, you have the wrist joint. So the wrist joint typically has a cupping surface. Okay, there is a cupping surface, and these are the carpal bones. The carpal bones is forming that ovoid structure. Okay, this is the ovoid structure. The cupped surface is formed by the radius and the fibrocartilage. So it will allow only 2 movements. You can see one axis of movement like this, okay, in this axis, and another axis of movement in this way, but not rotatory movement. Rotatory movement is restricted. Okay, this is typically seen in wrist joint, which allows only flexion extension and abduction and adduction, but not rotatory movements within the wrist joint. Okay, other joints where you have this is the metacarpophalangeal and the metatarsophalangeal joint and the atlanto-occipital joint. If you imagine that this is an ovoid surface, okay, and this is the reciprocal ovoid concave surface, and these two are articulating, then you will have an amount of flexion and extension in this, an amount of abduction and adduction in it, but there is restricted rotation. You can't rotate it. Okay, this was a difference from the ball and socket joint. So this is called as an ellipsoid joint. An ellipsoid joint will not have rotation inside it. The example for this is the wrist joint. So in this wrist joint, this will be the carpal bones. The ovoid will be formed by carpal bones, and this concavity will be formed by radius and the triangular fibrocartilage that is separating the wrist joint from the distal radioulnar joint. We'll move on to the next. The next is called the sellar joint, also called as a saddle joint. This is the very important first carpo-metacarpal joint. First carpo, not other carpo-metacarpal joint. This is the first carpal and this is the first metacarpal. So between that you have the sellar joint. What do you mean by sellar joint or saddle joint? If you look at the distal articulating surface of the first carpal bone, that is the trapezium. Okay, if you look at that, you can see that this blue line, the blue dotted line, is showing that it is convex, and this red line is showing that it is concave. Okay, it is showing that it is concave. So it is concave in one axis and it is convex in the other axis. Okay, that is what you mean by a sellar surface or a saddle surface. And this is very important because that will give it a lot of mobility. The thumb's mobility is primarily due to the first carpo-metacarpal joint. The other examples of sellar joints are the sternoclavicular joint as well as the calcaneocuboid joint. Now, if you look at this profile, the surface, it is concave in one axis and it is convex on the other axis. Okay, it is convex on this axis. So that is what it means. On one surface itself, you have a concave surface and a convex surface. This is one sellar surface. You can see that in this plane it is concave, correct? This is concave. But in the perpendicular plane, that is in this plane, it is convex. You can see that the same surface is concave in one plane and it is convex in the other plane. Okay, so in this plane it is convex, in this plane it is concave. Okay, this is called a sellar surface. The reciprocal articulating surface, the other side, will also be same. See, it is concave in this. Let me just show you. This is concave in this plane and it is convex in this plane. So they can reciprocally articulate with each other. This is called a sellar surface or a saddle joint. Okay, this is how a saddle will be on the top of a horse, right? So that is why it is called a saddle joint. Okay, that is called as a sellar joint or the saddle joint. Now, why are these so important? Why do you need to know about the typical appearance of a synovial joint? There are so many diseases that can happen in the synovium. Okay, two of the common diseases I am going to show around here. In a disease called osteoarthritis, you can lose cartilage. There will be cartilage degeneration and a lot of events occur, immunologic events occur within the synovial membrane, which is lining the inside of the capsule over here, as well as the capsular surface. Okay, that is all involved in the pathogenesis in this very common disease called osteoarthritis, which is primarily characterized by cartilage degradation. It is a degenerative disease. Another immunological diseases that you need to know is the rheumatoid arthritis. In rheumatoid arthritis also, you can see the synovium, which was earlier only a very thin membrane over here that is lining the inside of the joint cavity. The synovium is growing very, very thick. You can see that here, forming what is called as the pannus. Okay, this is an immunological reaction. You can see a lot of immunological cells, which you learn in pathology. And you can see bone erosion over here, immune complex deposition over here. To understand all of these, you need to know about this basic structure of a typical synovial joint. This is why synovial joints are very, very important. With that, we'll end this session. So please have a look at the other types of joints in my other videos. Thank you so much.